In the last summer of the war, a handful of scientists stared at an equation that whispered the worst question imaginable. What if the blast lights the sky and it never turns off? The math said the odds were tiny. Not zero. Tiny. They pushed the button anyway. A white sun bloomed over a New Mexico mesa, and in that instant, the world learned there was a new kind of dawn. It hadn't started with that flash. It began 3 years earlier, when Nazi Germany had the continent by the throat, and rumors swirled that their physicists were chasing an ultimate weapon. Across the Atlantic, the United States quietly recruited an army without uniforms. 130,000 people spread across deserts and river valleys, spending money so fast it barely had a name. $2 billion in the shadows. Most didn't know what they were making. They only knew it had to be finished first. General Leslie Groves needed a place where questions went in and silence came out. J. Robert Oppenheimer knew one, a windy plateau he loved above Santa Fe, where a private boys' school kept company with Pignon and sky. Overnight, classrooms became laboratories. Fences rose. Mail disappeared into boxes with fake names. Buses ran on odd routes at odder hours. The new city didn't have an address. It had a purpose. Groves ruled with schedules and security checks. Oppenheimer ruled with charisma, a chalkboard, and a terrifying sense of time. He called the scientists luminaries, then demanded they work as if the night itself were closing in. At first, the path looked straightforward. Fire one chunk of plutonium into another. Make a chain reaction. End the war. But plutonium had a secret. Too many stray neutrons made it jumpy. Instead of one clean snap, you risked a fizz, a premature spasm that ruined everything. The simple design died in a stack of memos. Oppenheimer tore up the org chart and built another. Out went the easy plan. In came explosive lenses, precisely timed detonators, shock waves marching inward like a drum line hitting one note. The name changed too. Fat Man for implosion with plutonium, Little Boy for a simpler gun type using precious uranium-235. 2 bets, 1 deadline, no do-overs. But equations on paper don't win wars. Proof does. For that, they built a tower in the Jornada del Muerto, the journey of the dead man, and wired a grapefruit-sized core to meet the most intricate explosive ever made. They argued through the night about weather and timing, and one sickening possibility. What if the air itself catches and the fire doesn't stop? The lab report said nature would shut it down. The human brain isn't easily convinced at 5:29 a.m. Then the shot. For a heartbeat, the desert turned to glass. The light punched past eyelids. The shock slapped forearms and teeth. Oppenheimer would later say, a line from the Gita broke into his head. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. Around him, hardened men swore, laughed, cried, or stood without moving. Then they all did the one thing they were trained to do. Measure. The yield blew through expectations. The cover story went out about an ammunition dump accident. The real message crossed the ocean in code. It worked. Thousands of miles away, in a suburb of Berlin-turned-conference hall, President Harry Truman held a poker face. The heads of the Allied powers were drawing the shape of the post-war world at Potsdam, and Truman had a card no one had ever seen. He mentioned to Joseph Stalin, almost casually, that the United States possessed a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Stalin nodded lightly. He hoped it would be used to good effect. The conversation drifted on. What Truman didn't know was that Soviet ears had been near Los Alamos the whole time. Secrets had a way of leaking, even through desert air. With Trinity's proof in hand, the Allies drafted the Potsdam Declaration. It promised a rebuilt, demilitarized, democratic Japan, and warned of prompt and utter destruction if the terms were rejected. Millions of leaflets fell from American bombers. Radio broadcasts repeated the message. Inside Tokyo, a single word became a landmine: mokusatsu. To some it meant ignore, to others withhold comment. Either way, the clock kept ticking. Ministers debated. Generals clenched their jaws. The emperor listened and waited for clarity that never quite arrived. While diplomats wrestled with semantics, a different group studied maps. Their job was ice cold. Pick cities big enough to show the world what this new weapon could do, militarily important enough to justify the choice, and intact enough that the damage would be unmistakable. Hiroshima, Kokura, Niigata, Kyoto. Until it wasn't, the ancient capital carried too much cultural weight. It came off the list after fierce argument. Nagasaki slid in. Tokyo had already been gutted by fire. Hiroshima remained on the board, a logistics hub, a marshaled city framed by mountains that would concentrate the blast. And an order quietly went out. Don't waste these cities on conventional bombs. They were being saved. On the island of Tinian, where runways ran like graphite pencils across coral, the strike team rolled forward. 3 aircraft carried the mission. Enola Gay with the bomb, the great artiste with instruments, Necessary Evil with cameras. Weather planes flew ahead, peering through cloud. Navy Captain William Deke Parsons refused to risk a fully armed nuclear weapon during takeoff. He would arm Little Boy in the air. Over the Pacific, he worked in the bomb bay, while the B-29 grumbled at altitude. Minutes from target, his assistant removed the final safeties. At 8:15 a.m., the bombardier opened the bay and let the weapon drop. It fell for roughly 44 seconds, then detonated in the open air about 600 meters above the city. In the next breath, the temperature near the heart of the blast leapt toward solar numbers. Shadows fused to stone, roof tiles curled, bridges warped. The blast tore through districts with a ring of absolute ruin and an outer ring of fires that found each other and fed. Radios died. Phone lines muttered and went silent. Trains shuddered to a stop. In Tokyo, operators kept calling Hiroshima, then called the lines around Hiroshima, then called whoever would answer. The first honest report came from the sky, after a scout plane circled the column and landed in a field. Below the column, a city had become a shape. Back in Washington, Truman made it plain. The United States had spent $2 billion on the greatest scientific gamble in history, and won. He warned that if Japan would not accept the terms, there would be a reign of ruin, the likes of which the Earth had never seen. In Tokyo, arguments hardened. Some leaders believed the Americans could not possibly have many of these weapons. Others believed they could not base strategy on hope. Intercepted cables showed no clear path to surrender. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan, smashing through Manchuria and severing any fantasy of a negotiated peace through Moscow. The second mission moved fast. Weather nearly stole the target. Kokura, first on the list, wore a blanket of cloud and smoke. The bombardier could not make a visual drop. Fuel was bleeding toward the red. The pilot turned for the secondary target across the water. Nagasaki appeared through gaps like a moving picture between curtains. At 11:02 a.m., the implosion bomb, Fat Man, detonated in a valley city, its hills both diminishing and focusing the damage in strange, brutal ways. Another mushroom, another silence, another series of fires that found each other and burned. In the hours that followed, the atmosphere in Tokyo changed from debate to dread. The emperor, who had rarely stepped so directly into policy, spoke with a clarity his ministers could no longer avoid. He chose peace. The statement he would deliver to his people spoke of enduring the unendurable, the kind of phrase a nation remembers for 100 years. Not everyone accepted it. On the night before the surrender broadcast, a group of officers tried to seize the palace, to smash the recording, to reset reality by force. They failed. The record went out. The war ended. The bombs ended more than a war. They opened a way of thinking that never really closes. In the weeks after, survivors tried to make sense of invisible wounds. Doctors met illnesses they'd never learned to name. Photographers focused their lenses on shadows etched into steps and bridges, twisted like licorice. Scientists who had chased yields now tracked half-lives. Ethicists and soldiers and parents argued in kitchens and classrooms for decades. Was there another way? Would a demonstration have worked? Did the combination of Soviet entry and naval blockades make this outcome inevitable without the new weapon? Each side carried its own arithmetic for mercy and necessity, and none of those sums erased what had happened. The military lessons felt immediate and cold. A single bomb had replaced a 1,000-plane raid. A small crew had accomplished what once took fleets. For strategists, this was an earthquake, force projection, deterrence, diplomacy, everything bent around the new center of gravity. For civilians, the earthquake never stopped. School children learned to duck under desks. Civil defense manuals told people to tape windows, to whitewash basements, to face a fire you couldn't see. The map of fear grew global. Once a few nations had the power, others chased it. The club grew larger. Treaties rose like dikes. Tests moved to atolls and deserts. The sea flashed white again and again. And yet the arguments remain, because they have to. One side says the bombs ended the killing faster, that the alternative was an invasion and a firestorm of casualties on both sides that would dwarf even these numbers. The other side asks why a demonstration on an uninhabited island wasn't tried first, why a pause wasn't forced between the first and the second, why the word mokusatsu and the fate of a monarchy had to be resolved through detonations rather than language. Both sides point to letters and diaries and transcripts that feel as raw now as the week they were written. Neither side can prove the world that didn't happen. What no one disputes is the chain of choices. A remote school turned into a secret city. A failed, simple design replaced by something that felt impossible. A desert sunrise that announced a new century in one flash. A diplomatic warning wrapped in a single misread word. A flight where the last safety pins came out over water. A second city chosen by weather. A sovereign deciding that peace had to come now, or not at all. The story reads like fate, but it was built from decisions, each one made by people who argued, doubted, guessed, and then moved. The men and women who worked behind those fences kept their silence for years. Some wore it like honor. Others wore it like weight. Oppenheimer, the man who made a city of minds, would later face hearings, revocations, and a public unmaking that mirrored the moral quarrel in his own head. Groves, the commander who turned ambition into logistics, watched his project become a template bigger than any one war. Pilots and crew aged into grandfathers who still remembered a flash through slit goggles, and the people beneath those flashes rebuilt. They planted trees. They taught children to read. They carried photographs of faces that never got old. The nuclear age didn't close with the peace ceremony. It settled in. It learned to speak the language of deterrence and doctrine, of red lines and verification, of accident and almost. It delivered power and fear in the same package. It gave the species a mirror with a single question written across the top. If you can flip the world off like a light, will you ever choose to? So far, the answer has been restraint backed by terror. An uneasy pact that holds because the alternative is unthinkable. That morning in the desert still lingers. The tower is gone, the glass is buried, the fences are wire ghosts in the sage. But the idea lives, humming behind every negotiation and every radar screen. A quiet pressure that keeps powerful people humble, or should. The project's architects called themselves luminaries, and they were. They lit something no wind can blow out. The rest of us live in that glow, learning how to walk through it without burning, arguing about the choices that made it, and hoping that the last lesson of the first flash is the one that endures. Some buttons once pressed can't be unpressed, so we must be very, very careful about the hands we trust near them.